Hi, welcome to the first of the creative social events, which are taking place under the auspices of the Great Places Tees Valley programme. This first event is all about festivals and events post-COVID. You might think, why am I here in the chair? Well, yeah, I've got my brand identity behind me in terms of being from the Northern School of Art, but also the Tees Valley and Hartlepool in particular have a real festival scene which is developing. I founded the Northern Festival of Illustration 6 years ago, which runs biannually in Hartlepool. We've got the Waterfront Festival, we've got the Wintertide Festival, the Folk Festival, Hartlepool Live, and a range of other events. And Great Places is, if you like, sponsoring this series of events because Great Places is about building capacity and building resilience in the creative sector. And I think it's really important to say that none of this will be happening without that support from HLF, Arts Council, and from the Tees Valley Combined Authority. So there's the words from our sponsor. Another thing to say is that I've got two hats, as well as the Northern School of Art and the Festival of Illustration. I'm actually a North Area Council member for Arts Council England. You can all boo later if you want to. But it gives me a different perspective. And also this evening should give me things that I can take back to Arts Council. So maybe a few things to actually say about this evening's event. As Nick's already said, this is a webinar, so you'll only see the people who are actually talking. So that will largely be me and Paul, with Nick probably joining us just towards the end to give an outline of what else is going to be going on in terms of this series of events. At the end of the session, you'll also get the chance to get involved in a discussion about what you'd like to see next in this series of creative socials. And this is really something that we want to keep going both virtually and physically, not just through COVID, but forever. We want an exit strategy from special funding and we want your participation. So I'm going to introduce our speaker now. Paul Gudgin is joining us from north of the border, which has a whole different resonance these days, from his home in Dunfermline. But he has worked for more than 30 years with festivals, with supporting people in the development of events and festivals. Perhaps most notably, he's had a key role to play in Durham International Brass Festival, as director of the Edinburgh Fringe, and working at Aldeburgh and others. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, and I hope you all enjoy it. And as I say, use the Q&A or the chat room to actually submit questions to us.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Pat. And first of all, just to say thank you very much to everyone for coming along this evening. And I'm very much looking forward to this. But I think, I don't know whether anyone else has had this experience. I'm sure many of you have, but been asking myself after the horror show that we've had this year as well, is this still a business that I want to be in? And I've answered the question, yes, partly because I don't think that I could do anything else really. But also, I mean, I suppose I have invested just so much time and emotion in the business of events and festivals. But I think thinking a bit more altruistically, most of us want to feel that we're going to be able to do something useful towards the recovery of communities and our economy. And I have a very sincere belief that cultural events have a massively significant role to play. That's not just based on a hunch. What I've been doing is spending quite a bit of time really digging around in the history of events, recent history, to see what tends to happen to events after calamities and catastrophes. It's unlikely to be business as usual. And to do that, what I've done is gone straight to the sharp end. So I've been speaking to some people in Toronto, a friend of mine who ran the Toronto Fringe, people at the Hong Kong Arts Centre, the Malaysia Book Fair, who all went through the whole SARS epidemic. I've been speaking to people in the festivals and events sector in Ireland and also in Reykjavik in Iceland, who had that mighty financial crash in 2008. But also I've been speaking to a couple of people in Nice and also New York, who obviously went through terrorist attacks. So it's, it's quite interesting just what tends to happen in events, and there's definitely some learnings, post catastrophe. So really, I've got three very short sections. One is to just tell you a little bit that I've discovered from talking to these events, a little bit of crystal ball gazing, I suppose, from myself, based on some of that information. But then also some practical steps, things that we perhaps could or should be doing just at this time. And I think one thing that I have seen from the history of recovery from catastrophic events is there are going to be some experiences that are actually likely to see a surge in short-term demand. One of my favorite expressions I've seen recently is called revenge attending, this kind of pent-up demand. And the more I read about, what's happening in communities and things at the moment, it's obvious that, the need to come together is as strong as ever, if not stronger. And in some ways that's been seen in people's interest in still marking significant celebrations. It's quite interesting, the response to Eurovision the past few days. There was a rather ridiculous statistic I read from someone had questioned a factory that made plastic bunting, and apparently around VE Day they'd sold more than they've ever done before, despite the fact none of us can leave our houses. So there's still this kind of intrinsic demand to celebrate. But I suppose the most important thing is self-belief, that as an industry, we need to believe that we can recover and plan for it. So as I say, just SARS is probably the most accurate comparison to the situation we're currently in. Obviously nowhere near as global, not as devastating, but I think enough parallels to learn something. What's very clear is that in Hong Kong, in Toronto, in Malaysia, events played a really major role in post-pandemic recovery. And certainly in all of those places, their governments recognised this pretty much instantly, which is, I hope, good news for us. Some of the longer-term impacts they reported, they said that actually their audiences were more health aware for quite a long time. In fact, a lot, particularly in the Asian countries, people wearing masks to events for many years after SARS. But also they became much more mindful of official advice, and actually much more demanding of it. So what people expected to do when they went to events became more important. And looking at how quickly did they recover? Big question. Well, actually, in Malaysia, tourism, which I suppose is a marker, got back to its pre-SARS levels within about 18 months. And in fact, in Hong Kong, they actually had a major Rolling Stones gig within 1 year of SARS being sort of past its peak. And they actually had 40,000 people for a Real Madrid football match. So even though we're all concerned about big events and talk about the Olympics and big sports events, it was quite interesting that actually they perhaps restarted sooner than they anticipated in those countries. Now it's quite interesting talking to Iceland, different situation, obviously a financial crisis, but they came up with some very interesting points. They said, look, there will be casualties. There's going to be quite a lot of organizations and businesses that will not survive. And that's, it's a terrible thing, but they felt that created some gaps, which tended to stimulate a little bit of kind of creative entrepreneurship, either from people already involved in events or new people in the scene. So I think that's an interesting lesson for all of us, that actually, there will be some new opportunities coming out of this. They also said, look, even in the severest of recession, businesses still have to promote themselves. And in a way, they felt quite a lot of businesses, particularly in retail and hospitality, were slightly more open to partnership. Now, they're very cash poor in deep recession, but perhaps a little bit more receptive to working with us in creative ways. And Iceland's experience was they'd seen quite a lot of growth in their events in the early 2000s, but it really has boomed, particularly in Reykjavik, since 2008. One thing I really liked that they mentioned in Iceland was the ability to harness the goodwill towards artists. Their exact words were, people felt that the artists weren't responsible for the mess, and they felt a sympathy towards them. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, manifested through connections with artists online and supporting their online concerts, these kind of things, is perhaps a recognition of the kind of fragile lifestyle that artists currently have. I think, again, that's something which we can almost certainly build on. I think something that in some ways these kind of awful terrorist attacks in Nice, in Paris, in New York teach us is that, events sometimes have an important role in helping people actually reflect on what's happened. And I remember vividly in New York, this amazing gallery of people's photos from 9/11, which turned out to be incredibly popular, the pop-up gallery. I remember I was working at the Fringe just after, and we had show after show after show, which were actually dealing with the events. So in some ways trying to help people rationalize the events. So again, I think we have an important role. And again, looking at the, the length of time that these events have an impact. And apparently in Nice, they had 2 years worth of falling visitor numbers after that dreadful terrorist attack at their fireworks event. But actually then they had quite a couple of years of quite significant growth in 2017. So, this does seem to be a recurring pattern. So one or two things that came out from all of these people I spoke to was there does seem to be always increased government commitment to things like direct marketing organizations and business networks. Governments invest in them. They recognize the need for these agencies to do the work of reviving, particularly the tourism industries. There tends to be a shift in funds, which might not be so good for us, but actually there does tend to be if not more availability, a different availability. And obviously the focus becomes more laser-like. It tends to focus on areas like jobs. It focuses on particular geographic areas. It'll tend to focus on certain industries. So there will be a shift in funding, which we're going to have to be aware of and adjust to. Very, again, interesting in both Ireland and Iceland, they talked about the change in the relationship between the councils and events. In a way, it seemed to make the connection a little bit more strategic. And in fact, almost both sides had a little bit more focus. So again, I think, really looking at working in a focused and strategic way with stakeholders is going to be important. And I think opportunities coming out of these crises, as I've mentioned, that gaps may well appear, but also new attitudes to public space. Quite interesting how quite a lot of cities have been desperate to kind of institute car-free zones. At the moment, they have an excuse to do that, or it's easier to do it. And I think this is something that might be, if you like, a little bit of a legacy from this situation. Again, there is the potential for some fairly significant reinvestment in tourism after this, which may be some supportive to us. So again, if I get my crystal ball out and begin to look ahead, looking shorter term, what's happening elsewhere in terms of events in one or two of the countries that are perhaps a little bit ahead of us in the curve, a phrase we seem to use a lot at the moment. Well, quite interesting that in Spain, who are a few weeks ahead of us, they're now allowing open air events from June the 10th for up to 800 people. Bars and restaurants are allowed to open with 50% capacity. So it's quite interesting that they're talking about open air events, and that seems to be a thread that I seem to be coming back to a lot, that I think, open air events are seen as currently as a much safer option than those in closed spaces. Quite interesting in South Korea, one of the first places to have significant infection. I suppose this wasn't the good news, because quite a number of new cases actually came out of a nightclub district in Seoul. But what was quite interesting is the number of people who were gravitating towards a nightclub district in Seoul relatively soon after this situation. And that, which I will mention a bit later on, that I think there's going to be some quite distinct differences in the way different demographics respond in the immediate aftermath. Quite interested to read that Disneyland Shanghai has reopened. So again, I think there's probably things we're going to be able to learn operationally from them. They've got reduced numbers, they've got no indoor shows, but the other thing that they've invested in is very obvious safety measures. So, not just undertaking new safety measures, but making it very visible to the public. And also cinemas are reopening in China as well. Again, looking ahead, I've been trying to read as many research studies and things, and one of the best ones I read was the American Theatre study, who asked audiences about their intentions after this epidemic. Now, the bad news is only 46% of people plan to return on reopening. Most seem to be looking to wait 3 to 6 months. Quite interesting is 70% of people think they will return once there's a safe vaccine. But again, my mind keeps going back to SARS because there still is no vaccine for SARS yet. So I wonder whether, at the moment, 70% of people are looking at a return once there's a safe vaccine, but I wonder whether that figure will change as the situation develops. But actually, again, quite a number of people were much more inclined to go if there were very obvious safety measures in place. And it seemed that the higher number were obviously interested in going to what they call free to move events, where they were much less concerned with limits on crowd numbers. That didn't seem to be the issue. It seemed to be more about, if I can go to an event where I can, if you like, choose my own distance from other people, that's of more of interest to me than how many people are there. And those events with restricted access, so things like in theatres, but also interesting things like tactile events, things like children's activity centres or science centres seem to make people very nervous. So again, I think getting under the skin of what people's priorities might be, certainly in the short term, I think is going to be an important skill. I think looking ahead, this huge surge in online activity has been absolutely fascinating, and lots of articles about, is this the new approach for events? And it's quite interesting. I was reading of a museum that's had 150% increase in its online kind of involvement recently, which is extraordinary. So it certainly changed the landscape. One of the things that become clear to me, one is that major brands have now got involved and seem to be benefiting, whether it's things like the National Theatre, live at home, whether it's the Berlin Philharmonic doing their concerts live online, that the big brands are now big cultural brands are now much more significant online players than they were before, which I think is probably good in terms of raising the profile of sort of online activity and culture. But of course, it perhaps gives us more serious competition. The other thing as well is there seems to be a real interest in innovation, whether it's things like online listening parties through iTunes, but I'm particularly seeing interaction as being a major theme that's coming through, and I have a feeling that this is one that's going to last. Amazed to read that this Gareth Malone's choir at home, they're getting 40,000 people singing in a choir every night. As someone who's conducted quite a lot of choirs, that sounds like hell on earth to me, but 40,000 people. And also lots of these online art classes. So again, I think it seems to be stimulating a little bit of an interest in participatory activity, which I think, I hope and feel is likely to sustain. I suppose one of the big questions for me, though, is most of this kind of new content, exciting content, is generally free. I've not yet read of a great deal of progress actually on monetizing these events. Quite interesting that almost all the major biggest film festivals like Cannes, Toronto, Tribeca have come together to create the We Are One festival on YouTube. They are major players in the festival market. I cannot, and at the moment it's free. I cannot imagine if they cannot monetize that situation, that they're going to stay doing that for any longer than they absolutely have to. So I suppose the big answer from my crystal ball gazing is I think that the way we engage with audiences online and through digital platforms will definitely change. But I have every confidence that it's actually not going to replace live events for a couple of reasons. One is I think we have to recognise that not everyone has easy access to decent Wi-Fi, and so I did an intensive survey of my mother-in-law. Sorry, that sounded rather bad, but who lives in a rural part of Norfolk and has virtually no internet access. But she's a very significant partaker of culture. But of course, she has no interest in online culture because it's not going to affect. She cannot partake. So I think we always have to remember not to always look at our audiences through our own eyes. Even if we are avid engagers in online culture. The other thing, again, more extensive research in my family. Was talking to my sister, who is what I could probably term as a temporary convert, in that she has got interested in looking at some of these interesting bits and pieces around music, which is her passion online. But actually, she says and her feeling is, as soon as live events are available again, she feels she's going to have very little need or very little interest in those. I think the other thing with crystal ball gazing is I've been thinking about what's going to happen in our major stakeholders, particularly local councils. So it's been very exciting. I've been reading committee minutes from some of the councils that have been meeting remotely, just quite interesting. So first of all, tourism and recreations, especially things like sports centres, seem to be considered a much higher priority than culture. While culture gets a mention, tourism, recreation seem to be some of their key concerns. So that's something we're going to have to be aware of. And what's quite interesting, though, with a few of them is regeneration continues. That actually, where they have regeneration areas or policies and strategies, they're continuing them and are actively considering whether they can enhance and bring forward some of those. All of them, of course, are talking about immediate expenditure controls because they're going to have big demands on their money. So basically, if something isn't either committed or it's essential for COVID response, there's going to be a freeze on it, which could be a negative for some of us. The other thing as well is almost all of them are talking about an immediate recruitment freeze. Again, there's a negative in that because there's probably going to be less support workers within local authorities, but also that being the case, I think what we all know is sometimes when there's a recruitment freeze, it means they are more apt to actually look at external organisations to help deliver some of the things that they are unable to do. So occasionally opportunities. It's very obvious that local authorities are still very much in the response phase. But again, reading some of their reports, the recovery phase looks like it's likely to involve things like regional working groups. So again, I think something that's going to be important to us is to make sure that our voices get heard in some of these regional forums that are going to begin to talk about how to dig their way out of this problem. And I think the other thing with local councils, we have to consider they're going to have an even bigger, if you like, dual role after this. First of all, as regulator, they are going to be given additional responsibility for regulating events, but also as reviver. So again, we're going to have to deal with them on that. So just finally, a few practical things. I had a very interesting workshop with a group of festivals I'm working with in Canada the other day, where we spoke about what can we do now. And the first thing is, well, should we go ahead in 2021? I think an important question that they had to ask themselves, to a man or to they said yes, but also that they should make no assumptions about the scale or the likely support. And actually, an interesting thing is any previous planning cycles immediately have to go out of the window. And first of all, we talked about money, and we felt that certainly for these are all independent festivals, that cash flow is king. That actually not so much how much money you have, but when you spend it. I've worked on 1 or 2 events where we've literally had no money and been in this situation. So it affects things like staffing, marketing spend, but also having things like early sales incentives, fundraising, asking your loyal supporters for a little bit of extra money. So cash, having cash at the right time becomes vital. The other thing was just about being really creative on partnerships. So I've sent them away asking the 2 or 3 questions. Who needs us? Who needs our work more than ever now? And how can we partner with them? Who can we share the risk with? Is it people who supply us? Is it other events and festivals? I think a lot of them are going to have to be doing slightly different deals for artists. I think that there's going to be more artists working on the basis of box office and ticketing splits. That seems to be their attitude. But even vendors, getting vendors along to work at their events. The element of sharing the risk through profit shares and things is going to be more common. Also, partnering up in event networks, vital, I think, because we're going to have to shout loud as an industry, and it's always better to do it together. And the final thing on partnerships is just scouring our towns and cities for in-kind support. Who has something they can give us that will either take away some of our costs or add value to what we do. I'll say just 2 final things. One is just about this planning. We spoke about program planning in 3 phases. So planning now for the things that, in some ways, if we assume the situation will potentially stay the same, what could we do? Come our event in that case. The second was maybe 3 or 4 months out from the event to see to what extent the situation has changed, and to what extent we can slightly adjust our programming. And then the third one is perhaps a little bit closer to the time. So, very clearly having 3 distinct planning phases in terms of programming, and in terms of marketing, when in some ways we actually begin to go out with our message, and actually what that messaging should say. And overwhelmingly, it almost needs to talk about safety first. Again, this is something that came out of SARS. You don't just tell people what a great program you have, it's all about what a safe environment they're coming to. And making sure that we can deliver that. And then finally, just looking to our audiences and understanding there will be a difference. Again, in some of the research I've seen, older audiences are more concerned that there needs to be a vaccine before they'll come back. They don't want queues, they want hand sanitizers. Younger audiences seem more influenced by things like government travel restrictions, what other people are saying about events, and actually even the lead of organizations themselves. So I suppose younger audiences tend to have a little bit more trust in what people say, rather than the older audiences who want more concrete alternatives. And the final thing we said was local. I think what we know is, first of all, it's the local audiences whose support we're going to need more than ever. But also, secondly, I think really recognizing our value, but also our responsibilities towards the local community to see, what we can do to help revive them. Seems to have covered quite a lot of ground there. And as you probably tell, I normally talk far too quickly, but hopefully that'll have raised a few talking points.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much for that. I think that's given us both some hope, some caution, and some ideas. I'm going to start firing some questions at you. In that summary you gave us there, you already started talking about digital access and digital poverty. We had a question in from Imtiaz, which you've started to address, but I think to paraphrase that question, people who haven't got access digitally, certainly during this recovery phase, how do we engage with people who have no access to internet at home, don't have bits of kit at home that we as middle class, you and I, white blokes, have got coming out of our ears?
Yeah, whether it's practical or possible in every situation, I'm not sure. But I think, again, one of the really fascinating things that's come out of the current situation is the way performers have actually taken what they do into relatively small communities, whether it's cinema in the street, which I've seen, which is quite interesting. There was a supermarket I saw that's actually got musicians. It's really interesting. They've got musicians, they've invited them in to perform to shoppers, and they've got a contactless pay point for people to contribute. Certainly, I think there is an interesting opportunity to actively take what we do, into wider and smaller communities when we can. And I think the other thing is permanently asking ourselves that question: is every time we're doing something interesting and exciting online, is just saying, well, in what way are we excluding others? You almost need that little, parrot on your shoulder saying, what are we doing for them? What are we doing for them as well? But as I say, I think it's fascinating about. I think I mentioned this idea of, in some ways, it's opening up new potential spaces, for doing work, for kind of creating events. A silly thing I saw in Spain, where they have these massive Easter parades, and they created this incredible parade just using kind of puppets and ropes and those kind of things from people's balconies. So again, actually, finding interesting ways of taking what we do into people's communities will generate huge goodwill, as well as some interesting events.
Thanks for that, Paul. I think I hear what you're saying. One of the mantras that I think we need to start adopting is the notion of moving out of our venues and moving into the places where people actually are and where they want to be, rather than where we think they should be. I've got another question here from Jim, which touches on your regeneration point, Paul, and he's asking, I think this is in recovery phase and beyond. Can you give us some types of events that we can use to actually revitalise town centre economies, boost community cohesion? I note in your paper, which some of you might have read, you did talk about Hull and you talked about Liverpool. I think Hull is a really interesting example, but over to you. How can we get Regeneration kick-started?
It's so I'm just thinking, one of the events I was just working with in Canada. It's actually a jazz festival, and it's quite interesting because we kind of used that as an example, and we got people firing in some ideas. And actually, we stole a bit of an example, from a jazz festival in Finland called the Pori Jazz Festival, where they have this thing called Jazz Street, where they actually have a whole street with stages going down it, and they create pop-up restaurants, they create a pop-up market, and those kind of things. And we were talking, just saying, look, would it ever be possible to make an event like that actually work? And it was felt that we probably could, because we felt that in some ways, and again, like I mentioned, events where people have the choice of how much distance they can put between themselves and others, I think seems to be key. But also events where which are, if you like, where people are in motion, where audiences are moving past events, moving in and around events, I think also might be an additional sort of attraction. And I think if we're taking our responsibility towards regeneration seriously, I think it is looking at things like retailers who are going to be having a hell of a time in restaurants, and really asking ourselves, what can we do for them? Actually, how can we, and I think as we've certainly restaurants, are going to have to, a lot of them, change their business models, and they're going to have to be looking at more, whether it's takeaway offerings, deliveries, or actually taking their restaurants outside. So I think working with things like business improvement districts, and those kind of regeneration agencies as well to what I think one of the great thing about so many events people I've worked with is their ability to look at a space and come up with something extraordinary to do in it. I mean, I think one of the great, when we look back at the history of festivals over the past decade, I think one of the great sort of surges has been in interesting, extraordinary site-specific work. So I think as event organizers, I think that's a skill we've already been developing. I think we just need to we need to change a little bit of the angle of that. So it's not just about getting the creative juices flowing in terms of creating an amazing artistic experience. It's now getting those same antennae working. How can we create safe and revitalizing experiences as well? So I think that's a skill that we often have that's going to be absolutely fundamental.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to abuse my position here and say, where does co-creation come into that mix? If we're thinking about social inclusion and the skills that events organisers and creatives have, where does co-creation with the community fit into this?
Well, as I mentioned, I think what's been really interesting is the way that some of the creative activity online that has had huge surges in popularity have been those that have actually involved people in doing rather than just watching. And I think certainly that's made me think actually how can we involve how can we get thousands or even hundreds or dozens of people involved in actively in our events, either through online platforms or just by submitting work. So there was a lovely one, for example, I saw the other day about a school that got all their pupils to send in artwork, which they've now used to decorate railings around a very popular local park. So I think I think in some ways this situation should make us take co-creation more seriously than we ever have done before. Perhaps in some ways, and I'm probably guilty as charged, occasionally we paid lip service to it. That you've sort of, you want to have people involved, but it's really about these grown-up artists over here. And I think something that we've learned from the current situation is this huge hunger out there for people to be actively involved in expressing themselves through culture. So, put them in the middle.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Fiona is asking if, given that the Northeast is full of wide open spaces, does the fact that the Northeast in particular is so big, so sparse, give us an opportunity to do something a bit different? And if I can sort of add something on there, I was wondering if that could relate also to the eco-museum model, where you have multi-sites, you don't have a fixed permanent home for something. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think interesting. One thing that's fascinating anyway is that quite a lot of sort of the bigger a lot of big UK festivals do tend to happen outside of the main conurbations. It's quite interesting that our biggest book festival is in Hay, middle of nowhere. Obviously, I used to work at Alva Music Festival, middle of nowhere. So I mean, actually, that idea of escape for festivals is already quite deeply entrenched. I think that's going to become even stronger because I think a lot of the sort of hotspots for COVID-19 has actually been in conurbations in built-up areas. So I think that while people might not have the choice or even the desire maybe to move away from cities from an employment point of view, I think there will almost certainly in the short to medium term be a real desire for people to get out of major conurbations and out into more sort of open areas. I think we're seeing this, it's why the police are having to patrol, beauty hotspots and these kind of things. I think we're already seeing there's that demand to be out in the open. So I think the Northeast is potentially in a strong position to capitalise on that. I think the balance, and again we're seeing this certainly at the moment, is measuring that against a local community's concern about having a lot of incomers. I wonder if I went to a small local community and said, I want to help regenerate the town, I want to put on this event and we want 10,000 people to come and roam the countryside over a weekend, I can imagine the response. So I think there is a balance there, but as I say, my I have no evidence, but my gut instinct is this urge to get out of the city will actually be pretty strong for some time to come.
And I think I'd add to that with memories of tents with Fiona Shaw reciting poetry near Bamburgh Castle in sand dunes, with dance taking place on the beach, and multi-site events all under the same theme, which can distribute the number of people attending in any one hotspot and give them a chance to space themselves. So I think, in answer to Fiona questions, I think we've got huge opportunities. And I think we can also do that within some of our urban areas, because we've still got brownfield sites within our urban areas. We've got underutilised public buildings and assets. And we've got things like sports arenas where you can socially distance. So I think we need, as Paul was saying, to think about partnerships, but also think about what's appropriate in different locations and how it can be perhaps brought together with a common aim.
I think one thing I would just maybe think that I would add, I think I would caution myself really not to predict the death of venues just at the moment. I mean, I think certainly, as I say, the American research shows and some little bit of history shows that there will be at least a short-term reticence to going back into venues. But actually, again, one thing that I've not mentioned is, sport is a really interesting one. They are such a powerful lobby, and we know already that football and things like the Olympics and Formula One, they are pushing governments very, very hard at the moment, looking towards, reopening. I think, venues still have life. And as I say, I would be keeping my eyes very focused on what's likely to be happening in those kind of major sports events, because that's probably going to lead legislation and restriction, but also probably going to lead public sentiment as well.
Okay, thanks for that. In this wonderful online world that we're now living in, somebody's actually put their hands up. So I'd like to invite Chris to ask his question, please, and Mick will unmute you and bring you in, Chris.
All right, great, thanks.
My interest is with your Edinburgh Fringe background.
Yeah.
As you probably know, Brighton and Greater Manchester Fringe are hedging the bets on waiting until September. The news last week surprised me as Buxton Fringe has decided it's going ahead in July as scheduled, no matter what, and if necessary, they'll do the whole lot outdoor and online. What's your opinion of this idea?
I think fringes have particular challenges, partly just because of the nature of the kind of spaces that they tend to use. Often sort of unofficial, if you like, and unusual spaces which are difficult at the best of times. So I think they do have some unique challenges. I suppose the other thing with the Fringe is the decision about whether to go ahead or not. In some ways, is more complex because it's in essence it's a democratic festival. It's in some ways the performers who decide to come and those kind of things. And what I've seen also is quite a lot of fringe performers, a few fringe performers who are saying they're probably going to come to Edinburgh anyway in August. It's what they already do. So I think the Fringe has particular challenges. I have to say, from a personal point of view, if I were involved in any of those events, based on all the evidence and things that I've seen to date, I certainly wouldn't be promoting the idea of going ahead even in the autumn. I think there is we are still in such a volatile situation. The smart money seems to be on that. What we're likely to see is several sort of recurrences of the virus. From my own point of view, I think I would personally be serving fringe artists best by saying we need to plan towards next year and make next year work for you, rather than focusing on this year. So if it was me, I'm afraid I probably wouldn't be doing it. But perhaps those events that have decided to go ahead have a strong rationale. I did see, incidentally, talking of fringes, Regeneration Fringe, which is quite a new one. They have been doing us some quite a lot of work and things in actually trying to bring as much of the Fringe online as possible. And I really, I suppose, would endorse that. The ability to give Fringe performers at least some profile and some outlet for the work that they've been putting into giving a performance, I would feel very comfortable with. I hope that answers your question, Chris. Oh.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Thanks for the question. We have another question in from Aaron, who I think has an interest in this from his own position. But Aaron's asking how over the next 3 to 6 months can we, as artists and producers, address that issue that you raised, Paul, about this not being top. Culture is not top of the local authority agenda. Regeneration itself might be. Getting income in from sports centres might be, and leisure centres, but culture isn't. It's not necessarily seen as an income generator. So how do we address that? Yeah.
Now, it's an opinion, so it may be right, may be wrong here. My own feeling is that obviously the call on government money, and particularly local government money, over the next few months is going to be extreme. They're going to have all sorts of COVID-related issues to deal with. My feeling is while my sentiment is very much based on just how artists, people involved in events and cultural industries are suffering at the moment, I think the argument that is most likely to cut the mustard with local councils is the one about how vital we are going to be in terms of the recovery, because that's what all the evidence seems to point towards. As I say, that's why I've had this interest in places like Toronto and Hong Kong and Reykjavik and Paris, is that part of it is because I'm interested. Part of it is because I recognise we need to gather really strong arguments. So my feeling is how it's going to work best is when we do it collectively as groups of events rather than just lone voices shouting in the wilderness. So groups of events coming together, making strong cases, but also recognising. I think like I said with local councils that this we need to use this situation to provide a focus between them and us. We need to be able to work with local councils to play a role in regeneration. So say my feeling is I will be pushing hard and shouting loud and trying to do as much cooperative social media and mainstream media as I possibly could on the role that we're going to play in regenerating and getting as much statistical information and backing in everything else as possible. And recognizing, again, like I was saying, there are certain partners that will strengthen that argument. Tourism, they recognize the need for us, hotels, retail, hospitality. We need to get those people behind our argument as well, so that they're backing us up in our calls to stakeholders to invest in what we do.
Thanks, Paul. And I'd echo that. We have to make the economic case for us back to local authorities, and there is plenty of there's plenty of evidence out there which absolutely demonstrates that we drive tourism, we drive the experiences that bring the shoppers back. Here's an interesting question. Last month, Fortnite, the game, the online platform, hosted a Travis Scott concert, and 12 million people joined into that. A 10-minute virtual gig. So I think the question is, can digital actually replace live? Now, I think I know where you're coming from on that, but are we going to see digital consumption swamping physical consumption post-COVID?
A couple of things. Empty Shop sent that through to me. Absolutely extraordinary. 12 million people. That's incredible. But in some ways, it echoes a couple of things that I think about the digital world and culture at the moment. Firstly, the big brands win. It's quite interesting how whether it's big games company or big platform like Spotify, they're the ones who win. There was I saw a musician, a classical musician, saying a little while ago that she had 750,000 people had listened to her music. I think it was on Spotify during a 6-month period, and she got a check for £12.16. So again, I think those big brands are in a fantastic situation. I think, to be honest, I think I would be slightly more concerned if I was in the broadcasting industry than in events. With that sort of new experience, and particularly if my demographic was kind of 20-year-old and under, I think there's going to be there seems to be a pretty major shift taking place in that demographic. So I think in a lot of the events that I've been used to working in, which have probably been a post 20-year-old demographic, and cultural events, I don't think that those kind of events are going to particularly impacting us. But as I say, what is interesting is the way that some of the big players in culture, some of the big museums, some of the big galleries, some of the big kind of music organizations. One thing I've not yet seen is actually how some of the major rock promoters are going to respond to this to the situation online through digital platforms. It's quite, we've seen maybe, as I say, the music platforms like iTunes, Spotify, but not yet. I'd be very interested to see what Live Nation are planning to do over the next year or two. These kind of things, because again, maybe that might have a little bit more impact on what we do. As I say, and lastly, even I keep looking around for examples. I still haven't seen many particularly small, medium-scale cultural organisations find, beyond fundraising engagement, find ways of monetising their digital platforms, which is, the big challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think you're right. I think you might hit the nail on the head with, for music, it is a big challenge. Live music finds this deeply challenging, and individual artists are really struggling in terms of digital income is, as you say, zero. I listened to the Tape Today programme as well with that particular concert artist. I'm going to wrap up now with one last question to you, Paul. And I think what I'd like to know is, do you think that socially distant events are going to play a big role in the stabilisation and recovery phase from COVID? So drive-in gigs maybe, or I don't know. I was talking to someone today about the idea of a kind of socially distanced silent disco in the streets. So what do you think about socially distant events?
The socially distant silent disco. That'll be a little bit like those discos we all had at school when we were about 11 years old, wasn't it? When there's still very much a, where that was the original social distancing, wasn't it? 11, 12-year-old girls and boys who didn't want to be anywhere near each other. As I say, my reading from history, that fascinating one I read in Hong Kong, how within a year, they had a massive Rolling Stones gig and 40,000 people going to football. I think, longer term, I think social distancing it'll become less relevant to more and more people over time. In the short term, my own feeling is, first of all, I think, like the examples we're choosing, it's going to be quite hard to create really socially distanced events that we as event organisers will be happy with. In a way, I think that's going to be challenging. Also, quite a tough sell. And actually, okay, as a little bit of a fad, we can go out and say a socially distanced disco, and the first one or two might get a bit of curiosity and be fine. But after that, no. But I think all the time it's just this touchstone of audience and public attitudes. I think so. In a way, as almost, it's without sounding too cynical, almost as a mechanism, really just to be able to communicate with audiences that we're taking their safety seriously. Again, on that, I think if I didn't mention, it's quite interesting how a museum I saw in Canada, they've adjusted the times when they have the cleaners in. They're making everything around sanitation much more public. So again, I think in terms of constantly promoting this message, that first of all our events are safe, secondly our events are good. That's where I think certainly some evolution and work in and promotion of socially distanced events is probably going to do us some good in the short term, in terms of proving that we are a responsible industry.
Okay, Paul, thanks very much for that.